Hello and welcome to my podcast. My name's Sam Ebrahim. I'm the partner for technology at U&U Recruitment Partners in Sydney. I've decided to create a podcast called Diary of a CIO. The purpose of this podcast is after spending 20 years in the technology sector in recruitment, I've seen a big gap in the market. There's a lot of content online and available that's really detailing the technology that CIOs look after. So ERPs, transformations, and technology stacks. What I've seen is the gap that really sits there is to understand the story behind the CIO. So their purpose, their journey, how they got to where they are today, and the stories behind the scenes that no one really hears about. The hope of the podcast is to really inspire other aspiring CIOs on their journey to understand how people got to where they are today, learnings to take away, and how they can apply it to their own career. So with that in mind, I would like to introduce Paul Keane as my guest today. Paul is someone I've known for, I'd say, close to 9 years. We first met when Paul reached out to me whilst at Dick Smith for some career advice in terms of his next move. We hit it off. Tracked his career from where he was then all the way to where we are to today. Someone that I class as a professional contact, but also someone that I would happy go to the pub with, have a beer, and a friend of mine as well. So with that in mind, I think to start off the podcast, I'd love to offer Paul the chance to introduce himself, but also just an interesting fact or story that no one would really know about that knows you maybe professionally, just to kind of soften the mood and start the podcast.
Thanks, Sam. So I'm Paul Keane. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Tyro Payments. So I've had a sort of varied career from being a technical software engineer through to becoming the C-level roles, yes, at Dick Smith and a few others. So from a interesting story, I guess probably the weirdest thing I've done in my career is when I was at Air Tasker, I was the CTO there, and they make you do the tasks. And one of the posts was dress up as a stormtrooper at a wedding. So I thought, I'll do that task. That'd be a fun one to do. And so I actually dressed up as a stormtrooper and took a lady down the aisle at the Chinese Gardens of Friendship in Darling Harbour. So I'm happy to share that photo. It's an unusual thing when she's literally holding a lightsaber as she's walking down the aisle.
And did they play the Star Wars theme tune as you walked down the aisle?
No, it was a real wedding, and this is the interesting part. We thought it would just be like a stormtrooper at the background and just for an unusual photograph. And to actually stand outside and take her down the aisle it was a proper wedding, and you know, she looked stunning, but it was an unusual. Very unusual way.
Definitely unusual. I haven't heard of that before, but an interesting story. Thank you, Paul. I think that just for this podcast today, I think the topics are really going to be just around your story, your background, and your journey to where you are today. I think having known you, there's some really interesting experiences you've been through that I think people would be interested to hear about. Also about building resilience. So I think a lot of challenging scenarios that CIOs and technology leaders go through. It's how do you build that resilient mindset, not only for yourself, but also for the team underneath you and around you as well, and how do you bring people on that journey. I'd also like to talk around, I suppose, assessing the technology leadership function when you take on a new role. So how do you assess the leaders underneath you in terms of who do you identify as high performers, and if you need to go to market to hire new people into a function, what is the process you go through in terms of assessing candidates coming into the business? And then we'll talk about other topics as well around, I suppose, balancing work and life, how to, I suppose, give advice to people who've had a similar journey to yourself and maybe come up with some of the same challenges. So first of all, I'd like to just give you the opportunity just to talk through at kind of a high level your journey to where you are today, the organizations you've gone to work with, the roles you've performed, and then I suppose to present day, and then we'll dig into a few stories in terms of the individual companies.
I guess so. My journey, my career sort of started out pretty a bit different than many of the people you speak to. Most of the CIOs and CTOs you speak to, probably top of their class, worked really, really hard and been smart all their lives. I started out where I remember dividing binary at college, and I decided that's not for me, and I dropped out. So I did what was basically equivalent of like a TAFE course, and I sort of did 2 days a week working in a tech company doing virtual reality at the time. This was back in '96 or something like that.
Wow.
And I think it's an interesting story in that lots of people feel like they need to have had to go to the best colleges and get your degrees. And I guess that is a more difficult path, not having that those degrees and those contacts through that. But there is no limit to getting to the C level, no matter whatever path you choose. So the way I did that was I sort of trained. I knew how to write code since at a fairly early age. So I did that, used that as a skill set, grew up. And then about halfway through my career, when I was at 9MSN, I decided to do an MBA, and because I was finding that I wanted to get into leadership. And then I took various roles and worked for, I think from the C-level roles I've done, worked at Air Tasker, Dick Smith, large companies like Qantas, and then specializations like Nuix, which does data forensics, and now at Tyro.
Okay. Just going back to, and just not a derogatory term in any way, but being a college dropout, that's interesting in the sense, I think a lot of people go through challenges in their life. Sometimes academics, the pathway isn't right for everyone. What advice would you give to people that have maybe don't have the right academics? Because in the recruitment world, we speak to clients every day. At your level, it's not too much of a consideration around having a degree. But a lot of the kind of entry-level roles, more junior roles, a lot of clients do mandate must have a degree, must have an engineering or computer science degree. What advice would you give to someone that really wants to get into the technology world, that maybe doesn't have the right academics, that maybe, like yourself, dropped out of college? What advice would you give someone to get into the technology world?
I mean, it's definitely a harder path, and you don't have a lot of the foundations. So I could code, but I didn't know, some of the reasons I didn't know why this was the way it was. I could just know I could do it. I think what university does is sort of builds that layers of understanding to the point of, the foundations, which helps you when you're sort of doing your day to day. For people trying to get in, I think you're going to have to find a way to get contacts in there and say, like, I know how to do this, whether it's even a general assembly type course or those sort of things, just to be able to get you that first job and go through. What I thought was interesting. I thought the restriction would be on the first few jobs, and it wasn't. The actual restriction I found, the ceiling was about when I wanted to get into leadership. People were, lots of them people are looking for these roles, and the competition is really, really high for those small amount of roles, and they're trying to find any reason to eliminate a CV. And because I didn't have a degree, I think that's when I found it really hard to get that next role. So that's when I did the MBA to say, well, actually, I need to have some qualification in there. And I thought that it had the double-edged sword that when you're a technical person, you're also not somewhat considered to be a good leader. And I'm not sure why those two things correlate, but I think it's really by saying, I have a business degree, I can talk to you about your net present value as well as I can talk to you about your low-level code. Yep. Sort of really helped drive me to those C-level roles.
And when going through that process, the MBA, a lot of people have MBAs these days. Do you feel it's just something to put on your CV? I've got an MBA. Or did you find when you're going through the actual interview process and getting into leadership roles, people actually asked you about your MBA and dug into what you actually learnt? Where's the value there for you in terms of what you got out of it?
Not one single person's ever raised an MBA. They got an MBA in any interview. What I do think it gives you is it gives you the language to talk around when you're in the boardroom or around the executive table, and the finance are talking to you about these different numbers and these ratios. You understand it, yep. And so you can then contribute to that conversation rather than going, oh, that's a bit something I'm not quite used to. So I think it gives you a language. I think where it gets a bad name is people go, I've got an MBA, therefore I know. No, you've done a 3-month marketing course. Does not know you know marketing, but it does mean I have the language to understand it.
Yep. And does that mean, I speak to a lot of CIOs through the course of my work. A lot of the CIOs said the function of a CIO isn't a lot of it technology. A lot of it is you have to be part accountant to manage budgets. You have to be part marketing. You have to be part communications to kind of be. Does the MBA, do you feel that, I suppose, the different topics of an MBA give you the rounded skill set to be able to operate at that C level when it's not just about the technology?
Yeah, because technology is unusual in that it touches pretty much every part of the organizational function. So whether it's HR, finance, the operations part of it. And what's interesting is that it's not that you have to understand the concepts of that business. Generally, the technology is the foundation. And so you can't just have a analogy or a metaphor against how things work. I actually need to understand that deeply. So having that ability to know, I know how those ratios, those financial things, I know how the marketing affects the underlying flow of to the financial numbers is really important, because as a technology person, you're probably running maybe the biggest squad or the biggest amount of people. You're running probably the biggest budget. So your huge amount of money and influence is part of your job, and so you need to contribute at the table. It's not good enough anymore to be a CIO or a CTO where you're just there waiting for the technical question to be asked. You've got to be driving the strategy going forward.
Yeah, interesting. And going back to when I first met you, Dick Smith, I think I want to talk about challenging situations, which I think you've been through a few in your career in the organisations you work for. Dick Smith would be the first example of that. Talk me through, I'm not sure the listeners know the Dick Smith brand originally, what happened to it and kind of where it is kind of moving forward. What happened? Talk to us about the Dick Smith situation that you encountered whilst working there as a CTO.
Yes, Dick Smith is interesting. I think it's on the director's course now of what happens when things go wrong. So it's an interesting use case. So just the background story, Dick Smith was originally bought by Woolworths, and then they sold the business to a private equity. The private equity did a whole bunch of changes to that business, which I thought was generally quite good. And then we listed, and then about 18 months after listing, the company went into administration. And it's an amazing experience to go through. So people talk about leadership, and they talk about, when people think about leadership, they think about the good times. They think about growing the business, setting strategy, hiring people and things like that. They don't often think about what happens when it goes wrong. And that's when you grow. And I think the NVIDIA CEO talked recently about, I hope you have bad times, I hope you build resilience, because that's when you learn. And it's a fascinating thing, when the administrators come in, what actually happens to the organization. And
was it wake up Tuesday morning, go to work, and the administrators are walking through the door? Was there any foresight what was coming? And I suppose from a technology function, what's your part to play in that journey and that experience, and how does the administrators coming in impact how you do your kind of everyday job or what you were doing?
Yeah, so I found out I got a text message saying we heard some rumors going around, and there's an issue. You need to come into the office on this particular thing, and what happens on the day? A whole bunch of administrators come in, and for your execs, they all take a forensic image of your laptop and your phones. So that's interesting. And it's terrifying.
Your work phones or personal phones or everything? Really? Wow. Okay.
Ironically, later on, they use a software called Nuix, which I then worked for. So that's another story. And it's just terrifying for the staff. And so what's really interesting from a leadership point of view is everyone then looks at you like they don't know what they're doing and they're scared. I mean, everyone's thinking about themselves, they're thinking about their jobs, they're thinking about their mortgages, and I think then you've got to go, what type of leader am I going to be? Am I going to be that type of leader where I sort of hide away, or I'm just going to say the corporate line and just follow along? Or are you going to step up now and go, right, there's times when you want to be that servant leader, and that's when times are good. And there's times when you're going to go, actually, I'm going to step up here and I'm going to, help them through this process, and we're going to consolidate together and become a closer unit rather than us spiraling out of control.
I suppose in those situations, they're not looking for you as a technology leader. They're looking for you as more of a human leader or people leader, like someone who understands and empathizes with, I've got a mortgage to pay, I've got kids, I've got families, is my job at risk? Like, how do you comfort someone, and how do you look after and manage people in that kind of highly emotional environment that's very volatile?
So the way I approached it, I was super honest, probably to the point of maybe the CEO wasn't probably too happy with it. But so you're given these corporate lines, right? You're talking about, oh, don't worry about it, we're going to find this buyer and everything's going to be great. Just hang tight. What I went with was actually, we don't know. And your number one priority is your family, and I get it. So you need to look after yourself. So the way we're going to do this is not... What I don't want you to do is to go off and go for an interview and you take a whole day off and therefore the burden of all your workload goes on your colleagues. Let's just be transparent. Don't be overly transparent, but just say, you know what, I need to go step away for a couple of hours. Go and do the interview, come back and get your work done. So you're not stopping, putting all that additional pressure on your colleagues. So we had that sort of thing where we were, somewhat openly talking to each other about these are some open opportunities over here, these are some other things, just to help each other out. And I think that what that did was everyone humanized everything. People trusted each other. We could be transparent rather than giving the corporate view, which can be a bit impersonal.
And I think as a leader, everyone looks to you as, I suppose, the leader in those tough situations. But no one really considers you've got to put yourself first as well. You've got a family. You've got like commitments. Were you when a ship goes down, I suppose the lead of the ship goes down with the ship? Did you kind of leave a bit early? What was your mindset about how you're going to look after yourself and your, I suppose, family whilst trying to consider help to look after everyone else underneath you?
I guess I can be fully transparent now. So some of us had these golden handcuffs to stay.
Okay.
And so you are looked after. And so you are in a different situation. And you got to, that's the other thing, is that you're telling your staff one thing and you're well protected on the other thing. So again, the only thing is you can't be transparent about that at the time. So if you are ever going through administration, there are these options for you.
Okay.
I think but for me, I hedged my bets. And so I was looking at other roles, as well as looking after the company. My primary focus was making sure that the teams were well looked after. And I knew which ones, some of them were fine, right? You're in the e-commerce team at Dick Smith, you're going to be fine, right? And there's other teams which are looking at after an AS400 mainframe IBM, and you're going, well, and they're generally scared because where's the next role? They've been at the company for 20 years, and they generally don't know what to do next. And we spend a lot of time going, well, let's get you trained up, let's learn some new skills, let's work through the interview techniques, and let's upgrade your CV that hasn't been upgraded for 20 years, just to make sure that they felt comfortable through that process.
Okay, great. Talk about next story in your career, Air Tasker. So great success story, tech business. You were there through a kind of a high scale up and kind of growth aspect. What was that like for you? What was the exciting journey you went through in that kind of growth phase?
Yeah, so I met Tim when we were going through administration, and I met him and I went, oh my God, he's fantastic. And he was about to go through the Series B round, and Air Tasker just at that point had started to become a household name. And so, or not household name, it was sort of getting, oh, this is interesting. So we joined there, and I remember walking to this thing, and there's like 3 desks. And you're like, oh, okay, this is interesting. And I remember my first week there, I was a CIO at Dick Smith. I knew what I was doing. I was very confident. And I remember the database was broken, the replicator was broken. I said, oh, somebody needs to fix that. And they're like, I remember the lead developer looked over, was like, well, fix it then. And I was like, so there's nowhere to hide when you're in this startup scale up, whereas there's plenty of places to hide when you're in this big.
And going from a traditional bricks and mortar kind of online business into a business where Air Tasker doesn't really have any assets. It's kind of a middle platform between consumers and people that provide, for example, Stormtrooper services at weddings. Yeah. What was it like going, I suppose, the mindset of a traditional business to this kind of growth, new kind of app online business? What was that like?
It's incredibly exciting. So, we had Channel 7 come on board, and suddenly we're on Better Homes and Gardens every weekend. And that was just, you're just dealing with mega growth, and you're just trying to ride that wave. I think that's, it's a different challenge, because you're just like, can you grow fast enough? It's an interesting one where you're in a blue sky or blue ocean sort of strategy where there is no market for you to really compare against, and so you don't know where the limits are actually going to be. I remember I was at Red Balloon, and they were doing gift carding for adventures things, and they naturally got to a point where they just can't grow this anymore. There's only so many times people will buy this gift, and so many times. So we didn't know where the growth was. We knew we wanted to go internationally as well, and lots of people were throwing money at us at this point, and you're going like, well, where do you go? And I think that the real key for that one is making sure you focus in the right areas, because suddenly all these opportunities come at you, and literally people are giving you $100 million checks if you want to have it, with really bad terms. It's like, well, which way? Do you throw everything at this, or do you grow sustainably?
And being the leader of a tech business that's kind of a growth tech business, who decides the strategy? Because in most traditional businesses, the business strategy is defined, and ultimately the technology strategy aligns to the business strategy and kind of execute. With being a kind of a very strong tech-focused business, were you part of that business strategy conversation, or was it more traditional execution and supporting the business kind of strategy?
We did have Tim had a sort of his vision from the CEO. The really tight relationship it was between the CPO and myself, the CTO, and we were sort of working through. I'm fighting for trying to scale this thing, and the CPO is trying to work through where the new customer bases are and the opportunities. Air Tasker is interesting because it's a two-sided marketplace. You've got to keep the people posting, and you've got the people be able to also do the tasks. And so you've got they've two different customer groups, and you've got to be able to keep both of those alive. You can't grow one too much without growing the other. Otherwise, you can't service the needs. So it's a really interesting sort of strategy, how we have a dual-pronged approach for it.
And what advice would you give someone who's in a growth tech business? What's the one bit of advice that you learned from that would be different to maybe some of the other businesses you worked in? What advice would you give to people that are in that kind of growth tech business?
Just focus on what's going to be the growth enablers. All the little side projects were all really nice to have. Distract you from the business. So, for example, in Air Tasker, we had partnerships with Coles where we were trying to do last mile sort of delivery, or we worked with a few other retail as well. They would give us a fair bit of money just to sort of partner with them, but it just distracts us away from the core business, which was what we really need to do was grow Air Tasker locally, and then to make this into a unicorn business, we had to grow this internationally. And we were so busy taking our resources away for these small opportunities, we didn't focus on growing the UK market or the US market. And I think that's where Air Tasker sort of missed its opportunity. And now it's trying to get there, but it's much harder in a much different environment.
Yeah. Okay. Talk about Qantas now. When did you join Qantas and when did you leave Qantas? What was what was that? Because that was overlapping into COVID.
Yeah, so I was. So not all disasters happen because I joined. The correlation is there though. So I joined straight after Air Tasker, and then I left on the last day when they shut down the business for COVID. So I got lucky, managed to find another role during that period, but. Yeah, it's a fantastic organisation. Obviously, it's had a few tough times since COVID around brand reputation. But I mean, during COVID, it was interesting. We had a team of 500 in the technology team. It went down to 15. Yeah. So it was quite a traumatic experience.
I've recruited for Qantas before and been down to their campus in Mascot, and it is like a little village. You've got, I suppose, the community coffee area that everyone comes into, and it's got a great vibe to it. It would have been very challenging, I suppose, having that large enterprise kind of scaling down. But first of all, what was it like working for a 500-person team? Because that's a huge number of people to be managing and looking after. How do you, for somebody who's maybe come from, people who are watching this podcast, who've come from smaller environments and taken their first step into what is a truly enterprise environment, what was the big differences you noticed in terms of how you had to behave or how you had to, I suppose, fulfill your job?
I mean, I had a really good experience at Qantas. The only thing is, it's a huge organisation. Technology is not its number one thing. It's the aircraft engineers and the cabin crew and people like that, and the pilots are the heroes. So your technology is taking a backseat in that. I think what's interesting is, as it's a bigger company, the politics get bigger. There are subcultures within the bigger, broader culture. And you're trying to line those up with values and things like that. So what we try to do with the CTO group there is that Qantas had a period of time where they outsourced everything to an Indian firm, TCS, and IBM. and then they started to realize that technology needs to be one of its core competencies going forward. How do we interact with we interact with Qantas now mostly directly through either using the apps or the website. I think at the time we were the second biggest e-commerce site in the country. And so what we needed to do, we wanted to build this culture around what is technology. We're very proud of the brand, so we were very attractive that way. And then we wanted to show how the technology could be used to make a difference. And so we built almost this technology culture within. So we built playbooks. We had meetups, hosting meetups at the Qantas, because it's a really cool office.
Yeah.
And we wanted people to go, people would come to Mascot just to check out the office and go like, well, that's an unusual place to be. Once you go there, you go, oh, this is really cool. And that was a great way to I think we had amazing talent in that organization.
I remember coming to visit you when you were at Qantas, and you took me on a little tour, and it is a fascinating, for somebody who's interested in kind of aviation. You've also got the rover moonlander in the Qantas loyalty offices as well. So it's a great place to work, and I think it would attract the right people there as well. You talked a lot about culture. Speaking to the people in my network, a lot of the leaders struggle. The biggest struggle they have isn't necessarily around technology. It's around changing the mindset that people have towards technology in the business and changing cultures in the business. So you talked around, I suppose, changing culture there. What advice would you give to people around changing culture? How do you take people on the journey, and kind of both in the tech function, but also the perception from the business about what tech is and the value it adds to the business?
Yeah, I mean, tech do act differently than most the most other people in an organization. And I think generally technology is a bunch of very, very smart people, can be a bit introverted, but also they're quite, they like to challenge. And I think if we have this like pull request culture. So now a pull request in code is you write your code and you have two people who then review your code and tell you whether it's good or not, or where you should be able to change that. And I love that, because it means like you constantly get challenged, you constantly have a place to improve. That doesn't work a lot for the rest of the organization. When the CEO talks about the strategy and the tech person puts their hand up and going, well, why did you make that decision? And then like, it can be exhausting, and I get it. But I think it's great that they have it. Does your concepts hold up to rigor? If it does, fantastic, it's a good idea. If it starts to falter, then it's probably you need to think about that idea a bit more. But it does have an interesting cultural aspect to it. So one of the things I think within tech, we try to build a culture is we want tech to understand what the real problems are, not what their perceived problems are. So we try to do that. I also want to create a forum where they get to have their say. And I think one of the issues we have with tech and where it falls down is tech generally wants a forum or technical people want a forum to be able to have their say. We don't need consensus to move forward, but we do want to have that ability to have a say.
What about working for a business like Qantas, where they're in the media all the time, sometimes for the right reasons, a lot of time for the wrong reasons? What advice do you give someone when you're in that high profile, highly exposed role where a booking the system collapse can involve all the media outside your offices asking for answers? How do you deal with that pressure, knowing that any mistake, you could be on the news?
There is more rigor just required to it. And there are times when we launch something or something failed and suddenly you're on the 6 p.m. news, and that's not great feeling. But you also got to understand where to put the risks are and whether not. So things like bookings of people in flight experience or pre-flight experiences before they get on board is really important. You just cannot fail of those. And other times we go, you know what, you can make lots of changes that we like. I think we managed to deploy at the time, it's like a few hundred times a week. So we were going through a lot of change. And we just wanted to make sure we had very rigorous testing processes. But I think what we want to do from a cultural point of view is we kind of put it out there that at the time, Qantas, we want to be the best in the world. That was the benchmark we set ourselves, and that was the culture we set with the technology, saying like, it's one of the greatest brands. People love Qantas, certainly before COVID. They were, it was. I think we won the award for the most innovative brand airline at the time. So we're just going like, you can go, what does excellence look like, and get everyone to step up to that. So if you are in a place where you are a high customer touch point, what does brilliant look like? And as long as people intrinsically believe that, and they believe that the quality is really important and what they're doing is really important, a lot of those mistakes don't get made. It's when people don't really understand the problem, don't understand the consequences of those problems, that's when it starts to fall over.
With function up to 500, how do you, I suppose, drive that mentality of perfection? I think obviously you've got your role, you've got leaders underneath you, and there's a lot of people in that kind of that function. That how do you drive that mentality of we are striving for perfection, and how do you address it if perfection isn't there?
Well, perfection is never achieved as well. I think that when you get to 500 people, or actually whenever you get to over 150 people, you start all those communications and collaboration can't have to be intentional. You have to actually map those things out. So whether we've done it at Tyro or Qantas, we've said, how do you share information both horizontally and vertically across the organization? How do you make sure collaboration is probably your primary skill set? People think about their own squads and their own teams, but actually when it gets to 500 and when you want to get your customers experience the seamless end-to-end experience of the technology you build, but you build in little silos, you build little fragments. And so what you need to do is make sure that you're collaborating, you're sharing what have you changed over here that could affect over here. And I think that's once you go right, one of the things I've always been trying to say to leadership is like communication, collaborations are my number one things. If you can't do those effectively, then you probably doesn't fit within what I would like to achieve. And so if you make sure everyone knows you want to collaborate, you set up all the showcases, you set up these big town halls where you are collaborating and sharing information. And that's what helps build, not perfection, but you build a really seamless experience that the customers go, all right, well, that was quite surprising, for Qantas, you could check in Istanbul on your Qantas app, and then we would give you information around if your flight was delayed. You might go, that you think that's a given, but if you then go to another airline, you go and hold on a second, I never, when things, the disruption in airlines is always the key sort of customer feedback area, and you go, well, if that's the best experience, you go, Qantas always looks after me. That makes a difference. Okay.
I think like Dick Smith, Air Tasker, Qantas, very well-known brands. Nuix, most people wouldn't have heard of those. That organisation for probably intentional reasons. Just a bit of insight in terms of who that business is and kind of what they do.
Yeah, it's probably one of Australia's great success stories, and also a bit of a corporate disaster in that we had a few corporate scandals. So what they do is they do data forensics. So whether you do a corporate raid, or if you the FBI might use them to. What they do is they grab data. They break that down and then they make it searchable. And the whole idea is they're there to catch the bad guys. Mm-hmm. And there's some amazing use cases of how they've stopped things from white collar crime all the way to people trafficking. Wow. And there's an Australian company that very few people have ever heard of.
I'd never heard of them until you worked there. That's probably, I suppose, as I said, intentional. What was it like working for? I think you worked for a Qantas. Something happens, miss their flight. Dick Smith, something goes wrong. People might not get their electronics. Air Tasker, the guy might not turn up on time. Nuix, if you don't do your job, that's, I suppose, putting people's kind of life at risk, or whatever. That I suppose that pressure to know that you've got to be on your A game because it's impacting more than just kind of profit. What was that like for you?
I think it's a different one from a cultural point of view because it's not operational anymore. So we actually just provide the software and then you give it over to the FBI or to whatever scary 3 or 4 letter agencies are around the world. And sometimes you get given some insight. They're going like, 2 years later, the FBI said, we used your software to use this. And it was amazing. Like, they found all these criminals, or they found this drug cartel through the software. So, the culture there, we try to use those use cases to say what you're doing is making a difference. So it's a bit of a long-term game. And that one that organization was a very technical these were people. We had a lot of ex-NSA guys in that group, and they are just scarily good at knowing how to go into a Windows kernel and finding out everything you could possibly know around what's happening on your laptop. So it was a really great technical environment.
And what was it like leading those people?
You didn't need to tell them what to do. They knew what to do. I think they were they just wanted really hard problems to solve. And so we would say, here's some use cases we're looking after, finding customer stories and saying, these are the things we're trying to find. And I think that there's an interesting shift as well with AI as that company was going forward was we used to make things very searchable, whereas as AI is much better looking at patterns. So if you're making something searchable, the police have to know what keyword to search for. But what you really want to look at is what is the unusual pattern of speech, because that's a keyword that you wouldn't know to search for, but that's something they're going, that's unusual, that's not a normal pattern of speech. Actually, let's go and dig into that.
Yeah, interesting. And how big is your team at Nuix?
We had about 220 in the tech team.
So in your current role at Tyro, you've got a team of about 260?
Yep.
I want to talk about when you take on a new role. So I suppose when a new leader comes to the business, their first, I suppose, one of their first priorities is to really, I suppose, judge their existing team, kind of work out who you want to keep, if there's anyone you want to move on, and then I suppose going and kind of recruiting. So a lot of work that we do at U&U and what I do is working to place CIOs and CTOs into businesses. Once they're there, then we help kind of build up their leadership teams if they need new people coming in. So my question to you is, when you join a business, what is the process you go through to assess people in the business, your current leaders? Like, how do you assess their capability, and how do you address who are the high performers in your existing team when you join an organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do an awful lot at C-levels. We go into an organization and then they clear out the leadership team, and I don't do that.
Okay.
And I think it does help because you bring your own people in and things like that. You slow down the organization incredibly.
Okay.
And so I think it's worth trying to find out what is the problem there is. Every organization has problems to solve, every single one of them. So you're trying to find out what those problems are solve. And then you work out, is it a people issue? Is it a process issue? Is it a combination of those things? And then you look at what your team have. And so I'm generally looking at sort of 3 criteria. I'm looking at, do they know their stuff? You need to know it. So I like the Atlassian way, and I think a few others, Amazon do the same way. Can you dive deep? So you need to know the surface level of things, but when I ask you, if I keep digging and digging, I can find out how much you actually know what's going on in the organization. Second one is, do you know your staff? Do you know who the top performers are? Do you know have you been performance managing people out? So are you that nice leader, or are you that high performance team, so more of a coach? And then I'm just looking at, culturally, what type of person, leader are you? What I'm generally looking at is, are you kind? And kind isn't nice. So kind is when hopefully your default is nice, but being kind is every now and again people either get comfortable and they need to be pushed to grow. Especially in technology, you have to keep growing. You have to have momentum. Or as nice is giving those feedback loops and things like that constantly to make sure they are becoming a better leader as themselves. So I'm looking at those 3 things: whether to know your stuff, know your staff, and are you kind?
Yep. I was told as a leader, and I manage people in my current role. If you're getting, I suppose, part of the review process, people are saying they're 10 out of 10 happy in their current role, you're not doing a great job, because you want to make people uncomfortable. You want to push them outside their comfort zone. And when you do that, that's when they kind of excel and learn. Is that something you agree with, and something you try and do in terms of pushing them outside their comfort zone and making them a little bit uncomfortable to get them on that journey? Yeah,
because you need to grow. So I think Netflix talked about it's not a family. Stop talking about a family. It's a high performing team. Yep. That's what you're trying to set up. You're trying to find a high performing team, and you look at high performance teams, sports teams, and I know they're overly used, and sport is not always a good analogy, but you can see those people. They are celebrating the small wins. They are constantly just tweaking things to make things. There's continuous improvement, constant communication and feedback loops. The whole agile movement was really about getting smaller feedback loops, and that's what you need to give to your teams to grow. Because if you're not growing as an individual, then there's a real problem in technology, because you wake up and suddenly 3 years later you're going, oh, the whole industry has moved on.
Yeah, I agree. That Netflix is quite interesting. I've read an article where Netflix actively pay very generous payouts to people that are underperformers, and they're quite proud of that, because they are a high-performing environment. They want people in the business to be high-performing, and if you're not, that's fine, and we'll give you a nice severance package, but kind of off you go. So it's an interesting story. When you are looking to hire for your team, if you've got a resignation or a gap or you need to hire, what is your Paul Keen's patented interview advice for people that are coming to potentially interview with you?
So I get really frustrated with interviews where what people do is we tell them a little bit of the role, and then they go off and they spill everything about their life history and hope that it resonates with everyone. And it's like, it's just the one thing I wish people did was, or encourage people to do, is find the problem. There's always a problem to solve. That either someone's left or there's a new role has been created. There's a problem to solve. So your job as the interviewee is to find that problem. And then when they're telling that story, you're thinking of all those things in your experience which helps solve that problem. So they don't need to know everything you've ever done. They can read that in your CV, or they can inquire if it's interested. But find the problem and then find solutions as they're talking. I also think there's a bit of a residual benefit. It's a bit like a first date. So if people start talking about themselves, they think they're having a good conversation, probably like you and I know right now. So it's brilliant. So they're actually doing majority of the talking. They're giving you the answer, and you just need to be able to align their problems with your experience.
Yeah, I agree. The interview advice I give to people that interview through me for my clients is, you might have an amazing background and amazing history. Realistically, the business has got a challenge and you're there to solve that problem. 80% of what you've done in your career might be fantastic, but probably irrelevant, and they're not interested in. It's that 20% that you've done that they're really interested in. So my advice to people in terms of interview technique is really, as you said, find out the problem and focus your answers towards that 20% they're interested in. And at the same time, give commercial examples, as opposed to saying, I know X, Y, and Z. They really want to know where you've applied that as well. So where you've done it in a commercial environment, and that's a really solid kind of interview technique I would advise people to follow. So appreciate that, Paul.
100%.
You're obviously a family man, you've got children, love the AFL, like to be social. How do you balance some high profile, demanding roles with giving enough time to yourself, your family, your friends? How does that work for you?
I'm not always great at it, but I do like the hobbies, so I am a walking middle-aged man of liking guitars and motorbikes and golf. But, so you do need to take time away from the office, and I haven't been great in that in the past. And so the way I do it is I have a really fairly strict routine. I love ticking boxes and I love a routine. So what I make sure we do is I have these set goals I try to achieve every week. And I feel that helps me switch off. What I used to do was I used to go to the gym in the morning, go to work and read a book. And I was just doing that every night, and I was just never switching off. So I do have a list of things I want to achieve every week. So I have a guitar lesson. I want to play guitar 3 times a week. I want to go to the driving range once a week. I read 4 times a week and do a bunch of research as well, at least a couple of times a week. And I put those down. I use an app called Streaks, and we mark those things off, and don't always achieve it, but I think the important thing is to have a good old solid bit of Christian guilt by not achieving those goals. But I like that because it gives me something to think about and to strive for outside of work, which gives me the energy when I am in work to go, right, that's my focus, and I have something fun afterwards.
Thank you, Paul. That was fascinating. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening today. I think the takeaways that I would like people to have from today's podcast is really around, I suppose, dealing with complex, challenging situations in the corporate world, the process you go through to deal with those, and come out the other side a stronger leader. Also around how to build good culture within the technology function, and also build good culture relationships with the business. Paul Keen's patented interview advice as well is something I'd be very keen for people to take away, along with my comments as well. And I think the importance of having good work-life balance. So making sure you've got some really strong activities outside of work. That means that you're not purely focused on just your work in your life. And now I'd like to pass across to Paul. I'd like to ask you, if you met Paul Keen 15 years ago, early in his career, put your arm around him, what would be the advice you would give him that you wish you had known at the time?
So I'm naturally a bit of a worrier. So the advice I would give to myself would be just work about what you can control. So you can't control your intelligence, but you can control how much you learn. You can't control the entire business, which I would like to do, but you can control how much of the business interacts with you. And you can't control other people's behavior, but what you can control is your reaction to it and whether you're a kind person or not. So my advice would be control what you can control and just don't worry about the rest.
Okay, it's good advice. Thank you. And for people listening, please like, comment, share. Please reach out to connect with me or Paul, and we'll be very keen, I suppose, to hear your feedback. Thank you for listening.